This is Bill Irwin, and you're listening to SleepyHollowRadio.com.
Hello, my name is Ari Kotler, and I am the host of Different on Sleepy Hollow Radio. On this show, you are introduced to incredible people who have overcome profound challenges in order to become successful. In this second installment of Different, my guest is the acclaimed New York Times bestselling writer, Miss Maia Szalavitz. Miss Szalavitz is remarkable in that she overcame addiction to become a world-renowned leading authority on the subject. As a writer, investigative reporter, and author, she considers many subjects including science, public policy, addiction treatment, harm reduction and confronting addiction, and love as an important treatment in recovery. Among the many news sources she has written for are the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time, New York Magazine, Scientific American, The Atlantic, The Huffington Post, Vice, and many more publications. She has served as a producer for the PBS Charlie Rose Show, Barbara Walters' aid special for ABC, and as an associate producer for the PBS documentary series Moyers on Addiction, entitled Close to Home. As the author of 7 books, including the New York Times bestseller Unbroken Brain, Miss Szalavitz has appeared as a guest on Oprah, CNN, MSNBC, and NPR. She has won awards from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the Drug Policy Alliance, the American Psychological Association, and the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology for her 30-plus years of groundbreaking writing on addiction, drug policy, and neuroscience. It is a complete honor for me to have Miss Maia Szalavitz as my guest today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Miss Szalavitz, welcome, and thank you so much for generously accepting my invitation. Before I ask my first question, I would like to mention that on the CDC website, there is a statement that reads as follows, quote, "From 1999 to 2019, nearly 500,000 people died from an overdose, including prescription and illicit opioids," end quote. If you or a loved one needs help with opioids or is experiencing traumatic issues, there is help available. Your life is precious. If you need suicide prevention, please call 1-800-273-8255 for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline or Google local suicide prevention lifelines for where you are listening from. Having read the incredible Unbroken Brain, I learned that you had conquered a potentially fatal addiction to heroin, cocaine, crack, and opioids in 1988. Tell me about your personal history and how it led you to become a leading figure in the field of addiction.
Sure. So when I was in high school, actually, I hosted my own local cable TV show, kind of similar to this, and I was sort of obsessed with being a journalist. And I had always just been a kid who felt really different, and somebody who got picked on, and somebody who just didn't quite feel the love and the friendship that I actually turned out to have had. So at that time, I was just very depressed and kind of despairing, and I started using drugs. And by the time I was at Columbia College, I was using cocaine, and then I got suspended from there, and then I was using heroin, and it all kind of turned into a giant disaster, after which point, thankfully, in 1988, I got into recovery. And so I was just like, what happened? You know, I wanted to find out, like, why this had happened and you know, what could be done about it to prevent other people. I eventually learned that I have depression, and I am also on the autism spectrum. The Asperger's diagnosis doesn't exist anymore, and it didn't exist when I was a kid. But if you kind of read those criteria, I kind of fit them very, very closely. And so I basically later realized that I was medicating some of the sensory overstimulation that I frequently experience. And so now I have healthier ways of doing that. But it just sort of took me a long time because there's a lot of misinformation out there about drugs and addiction and about how to help people.
So you mentioned misinformation. One of the objectives for the interview today is to end the stigma and scorn. So I know treatment is a real problem in this country because we have a lot of issues with our drug treatment, as I read in your book Unbroken Brain and Undoing Drugs. You mentioned that we have a broken system in America. Can you elaborate on how that system is broken?
Sure. So, unfortunately, historically, care for addiction has been separate from the rest of the medical system. And it kind of grew from an unscientific place, a well-intended but unscientific place. So basically, doctors gave up on treating addiction. They thought it was hopeless. And then some people with addiction came up with some ideas of, oh, look, this worked for us, so probably it might work for you. And so those ideas gradually got put into a whole system of treatment. And unfortunately, those ideas are based in the 1930s in Alcoholics Anonymous. And that is still the primary way that we treat all addictions in the United States, even though it's not proven to be the only way. It certainly helps some people, but the problem is that when you base a treatment outside of the medical system, and the main emphasis of that treatment is you have to pray to God, you have to find a higher power, you have to surrender to that higher power, and you have to make amends for the wrongs that you've done. Like, those are all great, worthy things that people, could benefit from doing. But if I went to depression treatment and I was told that I needed to do that, I would not think I was in a medical system. And so basically, in order to fix our treatment system, we need to separate self-help from professional treatment. And we need to make professional treatment better and more accessible to everybody. With opioids in particular, we have two medications that cut the death rate by 50% or more, and these are methadone and buprenorphine. But they only have that remarkable effect on mortality if you stay on them, whereas a lot of 12-step programs are opposed to people staying on them. And you don't count as clean or in recovery if you stay on the medication, even though these are meds that we'd be dancing in the streets if we had for cancer. So we need to actually create a treatment system, and it needs to be like across the spectrum of people's needs, so that, for example, if someone is on the spectrum, they could get help that is appropriate for that. Because, for example, a lot of people on the spectrum don't like to be in groups. And virtually all addiction treatment takes place in groups. So if you're, you may need to adapt that. And if you have depression, you may need something very different than if your primary problem is you have difficulties with like impulse control and like stopping yourself from doing things. If your problem is more like I'm stuck in my house and I'm afraid to do anything, again, and it sounds really basic, but the problem is that we have this sort of thrown together system that evolved that a lot of people now get paid by, and making change in it is extremely difficult because people don't like to change in general, and because it has been so historically underfunded and disconnected, and people don't get paid enough. There's many different problems with it, not to mention these ideologies that I was speaking of earlier. So in order to redo our treatment system, we really need to focus on what do we know works, how can we get people access to that, and can we make sure that care is as individualized as possible. And I actually just came back from Oregon, where they have decriminalized possession of drugs. And that basically means not that you can legally buy them or legally sell them, but that they're just not going to arrest you for personal possession. And they took $300 million out of, punitive means and put it into paying for new treatment. And I was visiting a couple of places that are recovery community centers there, and I was really excited to see what they were doing, because not only did they have like abstinence stuff and 12-step groups and different kinds of meetings, and racially and culturally sensitive meetings, and food and housing and all these kinds of things, they also had clean needles. And sort of historically, like, you could only get one kind of treatment at one place. And if that was wrong for you, you were the problem. not that the treatment wasn't meeting your needs. So I am hopeful that they will be able to develop a system that could be a model for the rest of the country.
That's real interesting, and I think the viewer's going to get a lot out of that. What is harm reduction? Because this is a turning point in helping people that have drug addictions.
Yes, absolutely. So the idea of harm reduction is very simple. We're focused on stopping people from getting hurt, not stopping them from getting high. We don't care if you have euphoria. We don't care if you enjoy yourself, whatever. That's not the government's business. It's not regulators' business. We care if you're hurting somebody else or yourself. And that's what harm reduction is about. So it initially developed in the 80s because AIDS was a very serious threat. And people thought that, oh, well, we can't give people clean needles because we'll send the wrong message. Meanwhile, they were just leaving us to die of ignorance. And, if I die in a corner of AIDS, that's really not going to prevent some kid from taking drugs. I'm sorry. That just is not how prevention works. And it's also a horrible way of using a human being as a, instrument, not as a human being, which is wrong morally, I believe. So anyway, harm reduction grew out of the idea that, like, wait a minute, we can give people clean needles. And, oh, gee, when we do this, people actually, instead of doing what we think, oh, they'll just go crazy and do more drugs forever, and they're like not going to ever get in recovery because we're telling them it's okay by giving them a needle. In fact, when you tell somebody that we care about you, regardless of if you change, they start to care about themselves more, and you start to see movement towards healthier behavior. Now, it doesn't mean everybody instantly gets into like 100% abstinence or something like that, but you see healthier behaviors, you do see some abstinence, you do see all kinds of pathways to recovery. And it's just amazing because it's, a very simple transaction that you just don't see. I'm giving you this because I want you to live, no other reason. And that, that can have a lot of power. And I think we need to recognize that, people who use drugs are people just like everybody else, and they can be enormously valuable or enormous pains in the butt, just like everybody else. And so, so that is what harm reduction is about. And some of the techniques that harm reduction has brought into the mainstream include syringe exchange programs and distributing the overdose antidote naloxone, which reverses any overdose that includes an opioid. And so, like, basically, most overdoses are actually mixes of drugs, but if there's an opioid in that mix, naloxone should reverse it for you. And obviously, this is really important because the drug supply has lots of potent fentanyls and all kinds of crazy things in it right now. And so, again, what they found was giving people naloxone did not lead to like naloxone parties where people were like, oh, yeah, we're going to take extra drugs and then reverse ourselves with naloxone, because that would be really stupid, because actually the experience of having an overdose reversed by naloxone is completely non-fun. It is basically like you go into withdrawal and you get taken instantly out of whatever high you were in. So people do not deliberately seek that at all. And in fact, people with addiction tend to be using as much drugs as possible anyway. So giving them naloxone isn't going to get them able to get more drugs. So it's a stupid argument, but it is common. But anyway, we do know that naloxone doesn't, like any other harm reduction measure, it doesn't make people use more. It doesn't keep people from getting into recovery, but it does save lives.
You went through recovery treatment in the late 80s, and I was wondering if you encountered compassion when you went through recovery, or stigma or scorn.
Well, there was both, I will say. The treatment center that I went to was not especially horrible. I did certainly get the, 12 steps are the only way. But since I had no idea about anything, I was just like, okay, if that's the only way, that's what I'll do. So, I did get some of, like, I had a ridiculous counselor who, like, thought that she had to break me down or something, and told me really strange things, like telling me I looked like Jiminy Cricket, and like, I don't know, like I had asked, why don't I have a boyfriend? Because you look like Jiminy, like that is not what a therapist
That's not what a therapist is supposed to do. That actually makes things worse. I mean,
yeah, Yeah. So, I mean, but I didn't experience, in some of my other books I've written about really abusive treatment where the whole idea is to humiliate and break you. And unfortunately, a lot of teenagers get sent to these places like wilderness programs and emotional growth boarding schools and all of these kinds of things. And the idea there is really to attack and humiliate you and to, make you the negative center of attention so that you will change. And that is not a good way of creating change. It is a good way of creating post-traumatic stress disorder, but it is not a good treatment for addiction. And actually, I wrote my book, Help at Any Cost, which is about the troubled teen industry, because I was so horrified by the idea that so much of treatment is aimed at breaking you down. And so I avoided treatment for a long time because I thought that all treatment was like that. Now, I got, thankfully, a very minimal amount of that stuff. And I just, I was so desperate for help at that point that I just did what I was told for the most part, although I argued because I always argue. But it turned out to be okay, thankfully. Yeah.
So I read Help at Any Cost, and I couldn't even get past the 40th page because what I found in there was so disturbing. What do you think about what you found in Help at Any Cost?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was completely that was, I have written a lot of books about traumatic experience. So I co-wrote 2 books with a leading expert on child trauma. So and my dad was a Holocaust survivor, so I've been exposed to a lot of traumatic things. Anyway, but the trauma that these kids went through in the troubled teen industry, and what I mean by the troubled teen industry is there are programs where parents can pay to send their kids, and they may be for a few months and are called an emotional growth boarding school or a therapeutic boarding school. They might be called a wilderness program or a boot camp. And obviously wilderness programs in the wilderness and boot camp is being mean to you military style. But this is an industry, and about between 10 and 100,000 kids are in it at any given time. And we don't know what's going on because there's no federal regulation and there's no tracking of them. And so when I wrote that, I was just horrified. And I interviewed probably at least 100 kids who'd been through it. And I also sort of continued interviewing people afterwards because I was the first person that ever believed them often. And they were sort of so relieved by having somebody actually believe what they had been through that I felt like it was my responsibility to try to, help people have that experience as much as I could, of course. But yeah, that was awful. And writing that was clearly no fun. And, but I mean, it was, it was obviously, I feel like it was necessary. And there were congressional hearings related after the book came out. And now we have Paris Hilton, who I never thought I would be praising, but she is going around. She went to a couple of these places and she's going around trying to finally get there to be some regulation of them. I have doubts about that because Congress really isn't passing anything these days. And I also worry that if you do the regulation wrong, it will make these places look legitimate. And that's the last thing I want to do. But, we'll just have to see how it goes and see what actually comes out to be in the legislation that's proposed and whether if we can make it good, then I will support it. And if not, I will oppose it.
Now, you mentioned a proposed law that would abolish the DEA. What would happen to illegal drug trades from foreign countries if this law was passed?
Well, so obviously we would need to do a number of things before doing that. One of the main problems I have with the DEA is that they should not be regulating medicine. So right now, the DEA not only oversees busting illegal drug dealers, but doctors, patients, people who they suspect of having issues with controlled substances like prescription opioids. They also oversee addiction treatment with methadone and buprenorphine. And the result is that we have a law enforcement agency regulating medicine. And they do not have the expertise to do this. So you end up with situations like we're having right now. There's a Supreme Court case about this. There are doctors who get prosecuted for overprescribing, but there is no objective standard for that because opioid doses can be very varied from person to person. You might have a fast metabolism and use a dose that could kill me 10 times over. Like, there's lots of reasons people need different doses. And yet the prosecution doesn't have anything to do with, did the doctor think he was practicing medicine, or was he handing out doses for dollars and, trading drugs for sex and clearly drug dealing behavior? So I am hoping that the Supreme Court will decide that, yes, the doctor needs to actually not practice medicine rather than do malpractice. Because, obviously you could be a lousy doctor and overprescribe opioids and not be a drug dealer. You could just be lazy, or you might think that somebody has severe pain and they're secretly selling the drugs. That is not being a drug dealer. That is being maybe naive, being maybe a bad doctor, but we have medical boards and other procedures, and you are not a danger to anybody without a prescription pad. So it is, anyway, so we definitely, all of the regulation for prescription opioids should go into the FDA instead. Now, in terms of dealing with the illegal drug trade, it's going to have to be a question of what is to be done with each particular substance. I think the place to start is not abolishing the DEA, but abolishing, except for moving the medicine stuff into the FDA, but with decriminalizing drug possession, because nobody can give me a good argument for why we should lock up people for possessing a substance. Some people will say, oh, we should do that so we can put them into treatment. Well, first of all, if we tried that, we wouldn't have enough treatment. We can't, everybody arrested for possession, and arresting people is not a good way of diagnosing them. A lot of people who get arrested for possession are just like kids who are smoking pot, and they just need to go home and get yelled at, and not, nothing more than that, really. So the first step, I believe, is just getting the criminal justice system and the DEA out of addiction treatment. And then we can figure out which drugs can be more legalized and how. I think, obviously, if you think about the whole OxyContin situation, we ended up with, that was legal drugs getting distributed on a massive scale, and it did harm. The way to avoid that is not to allow commercial sales of things. So, for example, in some countries, they prescribe heroin to people who are addicted, but they don't have salespeople going into doctors' offices saying, hey, prescribe heroin to new people, which is what we had with the
opioid crisis.
Yeah. So anyway, so it's a long and complicated thing, but you need to take into account the specific harms of the specific substances and all the, foreign policy implications and all of that. It is very complicated, but I do think if we start by stop spending hundreds of millions of dollars putting people in jail for a few days for possession of something and then doing it again and doing it again, we could spend that money on evidence-based treatment. And that in itself would go a long way towards improving things. For things that, we really don't want, say, Philip Morris fentanyl, right? So we have to come up with ways to not over-regulate, but not under-regulate either. And that's a challenge.
So you mentioned this term rock bottom, and there's a problem with this term. The mentality behind the term is not the best. What term should we use instead if someone is in such a bad place that they're at a point that it seems like they can't get worse?
Right. So basically, my problem with the idea of rock bottom is that it is only a retrospective narrative thing. So basically, let's say I believe I can't go any lower and I hit bottom and I go into treatment and then I relapse the day I come out. So do I now have a new bottom? Do I only know that I hit bottom when I die sober 10 years later? You can't use it scientifically to predict things. So I would just say for people who, most human change happens gradually. It's not like one day you're sober, and one day you're just completely chaotic, messy using, and then the next day you're sober completely forever of everything. It tends to be more like a learning process. So you get better, and then you slip, and you get better, and then you slip, and eventually you realize, oh, this slip is happening because every time I go and see that old boyfriend, I relapse. So let's not see that guy, right? So it's a learning process to change. And so instead of using the idea of rock bottom, which implies that if we're just mean enough to people and just push them down hard enough and just break them and make them hit bottom, we will fix them. And we know that kind of treatment does harm. We also know that, for some people, bottom is death. And we know that people are more likely to get better if you give them hope rather than trying to smash them down. Some people do get better when they're very smashed down, but if you think about it, who's more likely to recover? Like a guy who has no house and no job and no education, or a woman who's a doctor and has a family and millions of dollars and highly educated and high status? I'm going to bet on the doctor, right? But the bottom theory would have it that the homeless person would be more likely. And, again, sometimes this happens, but it is not a scientific way of looking at it. And one of the biggest problems with the addiction field has been that we have done everything by anecdote. This worked for me, so it should work for you. And if it doesn't, it's your fault. I needed to hit bottom, so you need it, So I think we can easily call turning points or epiphanies or whatever it could be, where somebody does have that moment and awaken and start a big change process. But I think bottom is a problem just because it really is not appropriately measurable.
So did coming from a typical middle-class household add to or reduce the scorn of being a drug user?
It reduced it. And I think one of the things that I instantly learned a lot about racism when I became addicted, because when I was arrested and I would go to court, I was often the only white defendant. And this is like New York City. There's a lot of white people. So definitely being white and being female gave me an advantage in terms of when I did get better, people saw that I had the possibility of contributing to society in a way that if I had been poor or a person of color, I might not have been able to make that visible to a judge the way I was able to do because I was middle class and white. I was at Columbia, it was so a lot of what I try to do even now is just to say, hey, that was white privilege. I think everybody should have that privilege. We shouldn't be there shouldn't be all those black defendants there either. But it is it's a weird thing in terms of the stigma itself. As a white middle class person, I was not used to being treated like complete garbage. I was not used to being seen as somebody who should just die as an example for other people. Whereas, people of color, unfortunately, have that experience all the time, especially in the drugs area. So stigma is complicated. And it also sort of has a lot to do with sort of the racist origins of our drug laws. Within it's, I've had this experience where people have come up to me, and because I do not look like, especially now, I've been in recovery a long time, I don't look like a person who has the history that I have. And some people will come up to me and they don't know who I am, and they'll talk to me about evil, bad, lying, scummy addicts. And then I will probably disclose and say, and then they're like, but you're not like that. And then, you're the good one.
Yeah. Which is the issue with the thought of an addictive personality. And the problem with an addictive personality is that we think that everyone that is not white or everyone that steals and cheats might be addicted to something. I also wanted to ask you, about a line from your book,
Sure.
which says, "Compassion is part of the cure and not the disease." And I was wondering if you could explain this quote, because that's a real powerful quote.
Thank you. Yes. We have long thought that, if you enable somebody with addiction, if you're like nice to them or give them money or let them stay with you or any of these kinds of things, that you're going to like prevent them from hitting bottom, and you're going to, by being compassionate towards them, you're actually not helping them because you're taking them away from crashing to the bottom. This is simply not supported by data. If you, it is sometimes necessary for families who are living with addicted people that are, say, stealing from them or doing harmful things to the family. They need to go, but not because that's going to help them, because the rest of the family needs to be helped. And, that's why they say, put on your own oxygen mask first. Like, that's absolutely, I'm not saying that parents never need to do that. What I am saying is you don't do that to fix the kid. You don't do that to save your addicted family member. If you want to save your addicted family member, there are much more compassionate and effective ways of doing so. And compassion is so important because a lot of times people, because of the stigma, they just see addiction like, oh, they're liars, oh, they're selfish, like they're antisocial, they're mean and horrible, nasty people. And, for the most part, like, yeah, there are some jerks among people with addiction, just like there's jerks in every other population. But for the most part, people with addiction are just trying to feel okay and just trying to deal with living in their neurology the best they can. All of us are wired differently, and different people are going to need different things to cope with that. And certain coping methods are not so good, but the sort of punishing somebody for attempting to feel loved, punishing somebody for attempting to feel okay, you can see why that does not help them. And I think it's kind of similar with the autism spectrum because, historically people have tried to stop people from flapping their hands or doing other repetitive behaviors so that they could just look normal. And those behaviors aren't the problem. Those behaviors are a solution often because you're doing that to soothe yourself or to stimulate yourself or whatever you're doing those repetitive behaviors for. So drugs are just kind of another form of repetitive behavior for some people. And if you take that away, you still have the underlying thing that makes you want to escape. So compassion comes in by saying, hey, yeah, if I had been through all that trauma that you were, I probably would get high too. How do we do it so that we're not hurting you? How do we do it so that you can live a life that's meaningful to you and you can do the kind of service that you want to do and you can be in relationships the way you want to be? And so that is another area where it comes in. But just, if we understand why people are doing things, it's a heck of a lot easier to help them do things differently if that is what is needed.
Your books were amazing, and I got a lot of information from them, and I'm actually finding stuff out here now, too, because you are a great guest, and I love that. Where would be the best place for someone to buy your books, and where would be the best place for someone to contact you?
Sure. So bookshop.org is a great place to buy books. It's a chain. It's like a collection of all the independent bookshops so that if you are of the mind of, I don't want to support the evil tentacles of Amazon, that is a place. Amazon does have it. To reach me, my website is Maia SZ, which is MAIA, S like Sam, Z like zebra, at it's just maiasz.com. I'm giving you my email address, which I don't want to do, but you can contact me through the website. Yes. So those are basically the best ways.
I also like that you have so many places where you can be contacted and you really respond fast. So I don't
always promise that, but if I can, I will.
And is there anything else you would like to tell the audience before you close our discussion? I mean, you are followed by the WHO, so.
Yes. No, I would just like to say that I hope, that you will have compassion for the people in your life who use drugs, and be supportive of them, and help them figure out, ways to connect and feel connected that are, not harmful. And it's, so much of what's wrong with our world right now is because we're so disconnected from each other and so alienated. And in this pandemic, it's just super hard. Everybody's irritable. Everybody's a little bit on edge. So if we can try to be compassionate about people's different tolerance for different levels of risk, we can make things better for all of us, I think.
I want to thank you for being my guest, and I'm truly honored to have the opportunity to ask questions. You and the audience at home learned a lot, and you truly inspired the audience and me with your story of triumph.
And I'm glad I was able to do this, and I'm glad that it was useful. Thank you so much for having me.
And I just want to mention that before we end, if you or a loved one has been struggling with addiction or is contemplating suicide or in a bad state, there is help available for you. There are lifelines available for suicide, and a quick Google search can help you find local help. Please remember this. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Good night or good day. This has been Ari Kotler, and you are listening to SleepyHollowRadio.com.
Thank you so much. That was great.
You're broken down and tired of living life on the merry-go-round. And you can't find a fighter, but I see it in you, so we gon' walk it out. Move mountains, we gon' walk it out, and move mountains. And I'll rise up, I'll rise like the day. And I'll rise up, I like the waves, I rise up, in spite of the ache, I rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. The silence isn't quiet, and it feels like it's getting hard to breathe. And I know you feel like dying, but I promise we'll take the world to its feet. Move mountains, bring it to its feet. Move mountains. And I'll rise up, I'll rise like the day. I'll rise up, I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. And for that we have each other. And we will rise, we will rise, we'll rise. Oh, we'll rise. I'll rise up, rise like the day. I'll rise up. In spite of the ache, I will rise 1,000 times again.